This week, Eric Capuano from Recon InfoSec is with us to discuss the evolution of the SIEM. Then Tim Malcolm-Vetter from Sideris joins us to talk about lessons learned from a career alternating between blue and red teams. Finally, in the enterprise security news, we were off for a week, so there are now 17 fundings to discuss. AI security startups emerge, and 8 acquisitions to discuss. Sneak loses 50% of its valuation. Is building security tools the wrong approach? SEC delays new cybersecurity rules, and why Taylor Swift fans should work in security. All that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly.
The cybersecurity landscape is full of single solution providers, making it easy for unexpected cyber threats to sneak through the cracks. That's why Fortra is creating a stronger, simpler strategy for protection, one that increases your security maturity while decreasing the operational burden that comes with it. This is all possible thanks to Fortra's best-in-class portfolio and deep bench of expert problem solvers. Fortra's integrated, scalable solutions help customers face their toughest challenges with confidence. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Fortra, Fortra. Do the words free time or relaxation sound foreign to you? Perhaps you've been stuck in the office too long, battling cyber threats or worrying about the next strain of ransomware. Let Sophos help provide peace of mind 24/7, 365 with cybersecurity delivered as a service. Because we want you to get back to your weekends, family dinners, and everything in between. And you'll get there with Sophos. Visit securityweekly.com/Sophos to learn more. Are you constantly thinking about how to keep your enterprise as secure as possible? Get to know Chrome Enterprise, the trusted browser for security-conscious professionals like you. Its ease of use for IT and security teams and added access controls protect the remote, extended, and hybrid workforce, keeping your entire enterprise safe. Don't settle for a browser that compromises your organization. Visit securityweekly.com/Chrome Enterprise now to learn more and start protecting your enterprise like never before. Welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly and happy National Beans and Franks Day. That was the least worst of 3 very bad options for today. This is episode 323, recorded on Thursday, July 13th, 2023. I'm your host, Adrian Sanabria, and joining me is the Czar of Zero Trust, the captain of content, the reformed analyst, Katie Teitler. How are you, Katie?
I am well. How are you, Adrian?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm a little sad. We're supposed to have Guillaume Ross with us, but there are tornado warnings and storms up in Montreal. So hopefully he'll pop in here whenever he can. I'm very excited about his intro. So even though he's probably gonna join after we're done with all the intros, I'm still gonna read his intro because I'm very excited about it.
I think that's more than appropriate.
All right. Quick announcement here. Follow us on LinkedIn for updates across our organization, show highlights, and more. You can find us by searching for Security Weekly Productions. And sorry, I just blew past the National Day because I don't want to talk about beans and franks. I'd rather talk about Eric Capuano and what he's up to. And today's topic is moving away from traditional SIEMs. And I'm being diplomatic with that description. We're excited to have Eric Capuano, co-founder and CTO of Recon InfoSec, with us today. He is also a certified SANS instructor of digital forensics and incident response, and a former cyber warfare operator in the Texas Air National Guard. Welcome, Eric.
Hey, Adrian. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Really excited to bring up this kind of hot topic.
Yeah, so it's funny I'm being so diplomatic because the title I put on this in the actual show notes, if you're looking, that is, and this will be the YouTube title also when it gets uploaded, is "It's Time for the Traditional SIEM to Die," which is a bit more to the point.
Yeah, definitely. And this isn't a new idea, right? I think a lot of folks kind of, will tease this a little bit, on social media and elsewhere. But it's funny because just as many people as you'll see that will kind of raise this question of, is the SIEM really serving the purpose that we intended it to, that we expected that it would? You'll see just as many people coming to its defense, like, hey, people who say the SIEM needs to die obviously have no idea how important a SIEM is and all the purposes that it serves. And so there's definitely valid arguments on both sides of the of this kind of problem. But I think that by just kind of, putting on the hat of, oh, well, SIEM is important, so of course it's useful, it doesn't need to change, ignores the opportunities to innovate and to do things smarter, right? And one of the same things we harp on in security is things can't stay the same, right? If you look at application security and enterprise network security and things like that, none of these things can stay the same, or we'd still be dealing with the critical dumpster fire that we had in like the 90s and early 2000s. So obviously things moving forward is obviously progress, and therefore why should the SIEM be ignored in this equation, right? And so that's kind of the stance that I take on this.
Yeah, and it's something that we cover a lot because we do a lot of market analysis. Both Katie and I used to be industry analysts, so we kind of have that big picture view of the market, and what it's done over the last couple of decades. And certainly something that we see, a trend that we see, is with the benefit of hindsight, some of these categories just aren't very efficient. They're too labor intensive. And there's opportunities to build a better version of that. I think SOAR is another excellent place to look at here. If you look at the Gen 1 SOAR versus the newer ones that have come out more recently, the amount of time and labor it takes to put together the same automation is quite different.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me also preface with, I don't think that the answer exists today to prompt all big mature organizations to just suddenly abandon the SOAR in favor of some new, and wildly, different approach. But I think that the underlying technologies and ideas now exist, and several proof of concepts, I should say, they're more mature than proof of concepts. Things like Chronicle and one of my favorite platforms, Lima Charlie. These technologies that exist today have kind of proven there's a better way of doing this, and the underlying sort of thought process actually is wildly simple when you start to think about it. But you're 100% right. The Gen 1 of anything is going to be the clunkier, more expensive, both in cost, financial cost, but also in labor. And we should constantly be pushing vendors to reduce that cost, but also recognize when maybe the vendors aren't the solution, or maybe the vendors are motivated with competing interests. They're not motivated necessarily to make these things more affordable to you, right? Because that's money out of their pockets. And so at what point do we kind of start thinking outside the box of how can we start to solve these problems ourselves without relying on a predatory vendor marketplace, And so it's just kind of a broad sort of intro to kind of some of my thoughts on this.
Yeah, and I think SIEM, however you want to pronounce that acronym, is the example that a lot of people give when they talk about inefficient security products or very labor-heavy security products. I think in the early days, a lot of people bought one because they, PCI requirement 10 or, something pushed them to centralize and correlate their logs and try to find security incidents in there. And just so many stories of companies that didn't realize, how many FTEs they had to dedicate to a product like this just to keep it up and running, much less the detection engineering and the threat hunting and all that stuff you have to throw on top of there also. So maybe, let's talk a little bit like what is predatory about it, like the current SIEM model or what we're calling the traditional SIEM model, which what I see called next gen SIEM is really just some additional features thrown on top of the traditional SIEM model. So I kind of lump that together with traditional SIEM as well. So eager to hear your thoughts on what's separating the newer stuff, the examples you mentioned with the older stuff and what's wrong there.
Well, before I start kind of attacking vendors in mass here, let me also own up and take a little bit of responsibility on behalf of the let's say the customer side of this problem, right? For years and years and years, security teams everywhere have gotten into the hoarder mindset, right? The idea of we've got to store and collect every piece of telemetry that we can from our environment because one, you don't know what you don't want to be in a place where the question comes down, hey, it turns out we got breached 6 months ago, but we only just figured it out. We now need to go back in time and figure out, all the little bitty pieces of footprints that were left behind. Nobody wants to be in a place where they can't answer that question because they don't have the telemetry, right? And, it doesn't help when things like the NIST cybersecurity framework and the top 20 and all those things come out and basically say, hey, step 1 is inventory management. Step 2 is you need a SIEM. And so everyone's like, okay, so apparently I need a SIEM and I should just collect everything because I don't even know what it is I might need 6 months from now, a year from now. So part of the problem is on us for inherently becoming data hoarders, right? And we hoard without question. It's just, I don't know what might be useful. I don't know what detections might come out, a year from now that'll rely on data I did or didn't decide to ingest. And so we're hoarders, right? So that is what enabled an industry, a whole, kind of swarm of product builders to say, ooh, so they want to collect and store everything. So let's price it so that they pay for all the, everything they want to collect and store, which, okay, can make sense in some situations, right? Especially if it's a cloud-hosted SIEM, of course, everything you're shipping up to this cloud-hosted SIEM, well, the vendor's having to pay for ingest and storage and all that. So I can understand that. But like what really kind of grinds my gears is when this is an on-prem SIEM, meaning you bought all this hardware, you're just paying the software license, and you're still getting charged for the consumption of your own resources, right? Where the problem that creates is now you either have, if a company's got deep enough pockets, they might just eat that and say, okay, I guess our Splunk bill is going to be $1 million a year or, whatever. Because because SOC compliance or whatever says we've got to keep, let's say a year's retention or whatever, that's outrageous because it's your storage you're putting all that data on to make that decision to retain as much as you are, but you're going to pay that vendor for all that storage. And it gets even uglier when you get into license models where it's not even just the throughput of the telemetry. But let's say you have some functionality that enriches that telemetry as it comes in, and now you're paying for that enriched data, right? So you're getting like double penalized here, that you're paying on the raw ingest, and then you're paying on what gets enriched, and then
EPS,
further stored. Yeah, and it just gets outrageous, right? And so now you've got end users having to make this decision of, okay, so maybe collect everything is a bad idea, and now they're carving out entire chunks of telemetry, which could very well be very important telemetry, but we can't afford that license, and so let's not ingest the firewall, let's not ingest this subset of systems because the bill is just getting out of control. And deity help you if you cross that billing threshold, and now the vendor has a built-in lockout functionality that says, oh, we'll keep collecting your data. You just simply can't access it until you pay us, right? That just, that stings.
It's a hostage situation.
Exactly, right. And so these are not situations or predicaments security teams need to be worrying about, like what telemetry do we or do we not collect because of license costs? It's like saying, which kid do you want to get Christmas presents for because you can't afford to get Christmas presents for all the kids, right? Like that's not a problem that you want to have. You would like to have the flexibility and the freedom to say, no, let's ingest everything because everything in air quotes, right? Because there's definitely arguments to be made about which telemetry is valuable in a security use case. But let's also now address the fact that how much waste exists in large organizations where you've got many different business units that are taking advantage of data lakes, right? For business analytics and all kinds of other things. And a lot of this telemetry is the same. It's the same telemetry, but now you're duplicating it into different solutions so that different teams can use it. Well, why not, consider a monolithic sort of data lake strategy that you own, by the way, not something that's going into some locked-in vendor ecosystem, that all the business units that need access to this data can kind of get access to it. And there's just so many cheaper ways to do it where you're not kind of shackled to whatever, big vendor does next year or the year after.
Yeah.
Um,
But and it creates other problems too. The more you ingest. I remember the first time I set up a SIEM, I had that mindset of, okay, now let's shove everything into this that they support. And we had RSA and Vision, and within a couple of months, I had over 1,700 devices in there, and we were logging somewhere around 100 million events a day in 2004. And all of a sudden, I had a new job because every single day, some of those 1,700 devices would go missing or stop sending us logs for some reason, and I had to go hunt down like why those logs were no longer coming in. Somebody redid the Linux systems and wiped the syslog, or some service account got locked out and we couldn't pull from the Windows systems anymore. And it was just every single day I was chasing down why logs were just suddenly not coming in anymore from a source. So as you scale with this, you add those kinds of issues too. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, the data logistics is its own kind of beast, but you're 100% right. The reliability of getting data to a SIEM is certainly something else to consider, which actually brings up another interesting topic. So I can't tell you how many times I've worked with a security team with an on-prem SIEM, right, which comes with its own host of kind of problems, right? Because when it's on-prem, that means your organization owns kind of the care and the feeding of this thing. And I'm not even talking about things like tuning signatures and making sure that logs are coming in, but like, what about underlying hardware? What about, scaling the clusters? I mean, there's so much that goes into the total cost of ownership of this. But the new big challenge around on-prem SIEM is, when the pandemic kicked off and, whatever major double-digit percentage of the workforce went remote, what now happens when all your systems are off the old castle moat, network? They're all distributed and people are working from home. How are you reliably getting data into that SIEM that you have sitting in your data center somewhere at your headquarters, right? And so that's a whole other challenge. But take something completely separate from that, though. Another big gripe, and you've probably encountered this, Adrian, is what about portability of that data? What happens when you're using a SIEM for years? You've got terabytes, however many ridiculous amount of volume of data in the SIEM, and you fall out of love with the vendor that you're using, and you want to switch to something else. Have you ever asked the question, what would it take to get our data out of this solution and into another one? Right? Do you really own that data? I mean, you might own it as of today because you're still paying that license, but like if you wanted to transport that data, put it into something else, is that even possible? What kind of lift would that be?
Do they keep the raw data? Because you would have to do the raw data, because the chances that the new SIEM vendor has the same like format for normalizing, after they normalize everything is it's not going to happen. You got to have the raw data.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I use an analogy that I think will resonate with a lot of, kind of traditional, IT and security folks that, back in the day when, kind of layer 7 firewalls were getting big and IPS devices, things like that, if you had a really mature approach to this, if you wanted to secure your network, not just at the perimeter, but also in the east, west, and all that stuff, you would put, IPS devices kind of throughout the network, right? In the core and in the various different segments. The problem that comes with that is what happens when I want to replace one of those IPS devices, or I want to replace all of them because, Palo Alto's too expensive and I want to go with FortiGate or whatever. Well, now I've got a network downtime problem because I'm going to have to break the network to pull those inline devices out of the network. And then came this kind of clever idea of, wait a minute, what about instead of just putting those devices in line with the network, meaning if I take that device down or it fails, well, that network segment drops and dies, right? Well, let's put these active taps in place. Just very simple device. All it does is pass traffic, but it can simultaneously kind of route traffic through an inline device. But I can basically shut that valve, take that the big IPS out of the equation without dropping the network. Okay, that afforded flexibility and resilience to network engineers that wanted to be able to rip and replace products and solutions. do you have a strategy like that with your SIEM, right? Because if all you have is this vendor ecosystem of log shippers that go straight to the SIEM and all that stuff, what happens when you want to try a new solution alongside your existing one or swap it all together? You almost want to kind of think about your logistics pipeline to afford you that kind of flexibility using things
like a Fluent D or log aggregation, something like that.
Exactly, right. And this doesn't have to be a big fancy product. I mean, obviously a lot of these kind of capabilities are native to the cloud, which I know can sometimes be a four-letter word for folks when they're thinking about the SIEM. But I got to say that mindset, I think, is also something that needs to die. The idea that the SIEM must be on-prem because we don't trust anyone with our data. Okay, well, I mean, at the end of the day,
it's not there in the first place.
Well, yeah, and I got to say that, folks, really, come to terms with the fact that Microsoft, Amazon, Google, these guys know what they're doing as far as running data centers, right? The foundational uptime and reliability and all that stuff covered, but even down to the security components of it. I mean, of course, you can misconfigure your cloud configuration, but the cloud itself, I mean, you're not hearing about 0 days in GCP, misconfiguration, sure, but anyway. You've got to break out of the mindset, because not only are all these features and functions kind of native to the cloud, but also the availability. So when all your workers are spread across the globe and remote, you're never worried about, oh, well, that system's off the network, so it wasn't shipping logs. It doesn't matter. If it had connectivity to the internet at a Starbucks Wi-Fi access point, it was shipping telemetry, right? It's good to go. But the other thing that we benefit from by thinking about the cloud and how it can enable us is the air quote, infinite scalability and compute power that you have there. So let me give you one quick example of kind of what I mean by that. So right now, the idea is we want to hoard all of our data. Well, your traditional on-prem SIEM treats all data the same. It doesn't distinguish between recent data or more important data than other data. So you're paying a flat price, for every bit, byte, and log you're shipping into that thing. Whereas the reality of it is, the data coming into your SIEM has a very short shelf life of actionable, valuable, right now, do it. Meaning, detect a threat, right, that's happening right now. I'm not saying that the older data is not valuable, but it drops off in value substantially after the first, week or two. So why should you be paying for all of that data to be sitting there hot searchable for a premium? Now, what is the use case of data that's past that shelf life, right? There is a use for it. It's things like, running retroactive detection or retroactive threat hunts and things like that. But do you really need instantly hot searchable data that you're paying a premium for to run the periodic, threat hunt over the last year's worth of telemetry? Or could you be putting that year's worth of backlog data into something super duper cheap like S3 or something like that, and then use the power of the cloud to spin up 1,000 cores and instantly rip through all that data for that periodic hunt that you want to run, right? And it's going to cost a fraction of what it would cost to have that all sitting in a big hot searchable Splunk cluster. Or even if you go the open source route, which my team is intimately familiar with, that's still an expensive cluster when you're dealing with that kind of retention. It's not the most economic or efficient way of getting it done.
Right. It's kind of like the difference between, like if you live somewhere where you need a car maybe 2-3 times a month, do you buy one and have it idling in your driveway? Or on the street next to your apartment, or do you just rent one, or call an Uber 2 or 3 times a month?
Yeah. I love that. I love that analogy, but to really kind of emphasize how big of a problem I think this is, Adrian, using your exact analogy, it's like you got a lot of teams out there with the Ferrari sitting there idling in the garage. It's not even just a car. It's a supercar that's burning premium gas, and you're right. They're taking it out to drive a couple times a week, and so the amount of waste that I see in this area is pretty egregious. And I just think it's we're clinging to old mentalities, right? Yeah. Or we're drinking too much of the vendor Kool-Aid, thinking that hey, if I just buy a SIEM, my problems will be solved. Folks, that's not the case. Whether you're buying the top shelf product or the bottom shelf, like it's not a silver bullet. And so own some of the care and feeding that it takes to build and maintain a SIEM, because it has multiple benefits, but one of my favorite benefits of kind of taking more hands-on approach here is it breeds expertise. If you're hiring folks and their job is to sit there and just wait for the SIEM to tell them there's a problem, you're never going to build a team of stellar, analysts and threat hunters, right? You're going to build a team of SIEM users, right? But if you put the ownership of that capability in their hands, say, okay, folks, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have an enterprise powerful, kind of SIEM solution, but it's only going to have, the last 2 weeks of data in it. Everything else goes off into Amazon S3, and then we're going to have these Athena playbooks or these Athena sort of queries that we use for doing our threat hunts. You put that in the hands of the analyst team, they're going to have to get a little smarter than just pushing a button in their SIEM. And that's where they're going to start getting better and more effective at their jobs, when they have to actually pull out the wrenches and do a little bit of this themselves. That's the kind of expertise that you want on a security team. Critical thinkers, not button pushers, right? And so that's just kind of another one of the benefits.
Yeah. Yeah, Katie, I wanted to give you a moment to ask some questions if you had some.
Sure. You covered a lot already, but in terms of working with the SIEM, like you said, it's really entrenched in most security teams' brains that they have to have it, right? And at some level, they have to have something similar. But when it comes to prioritization, the SIEM isn't necessarily going to do that for you. What are some of the things that people can do, that companies can do, to start weaning themselves off of that hugely heavy reliance and start building that future team, that forward-looking team, that very strategic and critical thinking team?
That's a really good question. And so I'll kind of piece together a couple of things I've sprinkled kind of throughout the conversation, but with more emphasis on kind of a order of operations here for this, speaking directly to your question. So one of the first things I think teams should be thinking about, especially ones that are sitting on big, heavy, expensive solutions, how do we kind of wean off this drug of this push button SIEM that supposedly is going to save us all? Well, first, start to think about how you break free of being locked into that vendor. That's kind of the first and most straightforward approach to kind of gaining a little bit of freedom here. And that comes back to kind of my tap analogy, right? Is if right now your SIEM sort of solution is very much, locked into this one vendor's way of doing this thing, think, hey, can we put something in front of this SIEM that's catching all the logs? Right. And this thing affords us flexibility to maybe split data, twin data, right? To Adrian's point, tools like Kinesis, right? And things like that would be able to take logs, ingest them, and then split them into more than one solution. Now you've got a little bit of flexibility, and you're less locked into that vendor, because now I can put something cheaper alongside it. So that's where I can start to do flexible things like, okay, this big Splunk instance that's costing us too much money, the only way I can reduce the bill is either ship less logs, which I don't want to do, or tune down my retention, right? Not hold it as long as I currently am, which maybe I don't want to do that either. Well, by introducing something in front of that SIEM that can catch the data, twin it to multiple places, now I can have the expensive solution and retain less, but it's still doing the things that it does well. And I can have a very inexpensive solution that's just basically my hoarding spot. Just ship everything to that one. It costs me significantly less, right? And so once you're now in this spot of freedom, it takes a little bit of the pressure off of, well, we can't change this. We need this tool. We don't have anything else, and we don't want to go through the labor of replacing it. That would be an 8-month project and cause all kinds of problems. Now we have options. It's giving yourself these options that even enables you to start thinking about, okay, now what's next? What's next is, let's check out this new cloud capability that would allow us to hoard 5 years of data at a fraction of the cost of what it would have been on our traditional SIEM. You have that option now because of this kind of forward thinking, hey, let's get something in front of the SIEM that would enable us to start kind of trying out new ideas and new concepts. But a slightly different point, though, to your question as well. What about organizations that aren't even there yet, don't even have the SIEM, but they know this is something that they need? Well, really, the crawl, walk, run there, in my opinion, is don't start with the SIEM, start with log aggregation, right? Which functionally a SIEM is log aggregation with some, detection and alerting and stuff built onto that. But really get your arms around ingesting data, because that's a problem you're always going to need solved, is that long tail ingestion of data, having 6 months, a year, whatever your specific business requirements are. So start with log aggregation, and then work your way up to SIEM, which is really just an evolved version of that. But if you start with log aggregation, what you might find is you've already solved the biggest piece of the SIEM problem, is aggregating data all in one place, just so that you can do intelligent things with that data, right? Analytics and detections and things like that. And you might just find you can solve those problems by just bolting on cheap or in many cases free solutions onto that existing log aggregation solution that will provide what you need out of a SIEM. And suddenly you've accidentally just saved yourself potentially millions of dollars, right, by doing it this way. But of course, let me also, it wouldn't be fair not to clarify that this requires expertise, right? This requires thinkers, builders, engineers, but this is the kind of folks that you want on a highly effective security team.
Sure, but then you come into the question of consolidation, right? We keep hearing about this need, this desire to consolidate, not just for cost purposes, but for efficiency purposes, because there's so much tooling out there. So now if you're splitting off the SIEM's functionality into various tools, does that create yet another problem? Do we now have people who have to learn this tool and that tool, and it's like counter to the whole consolidation model?
That's an excellent point. And so that's a sword that cuts both ways. But let me clarify kind of at least what I'm meaning to put forward here. I don't necessarily think that the most efficient approach is for like the security team to have their log aggregation or their SIEM, because what about the IT team that also needs access to a lot of that same data, right, for troubleshooting networks and systems and things like that, and then the business analytics folks and whoever else is going to. So I'm still very much for the idea of pooling this data in a way that it is accessible by all the various business units that need it. But a problem I don't think that we're going to get away from is, the IT team is going to interface with that data with their application of choice, right? The security team is going to interface with that data with their application of choice, because these are purpose-built applications, right, that do specific things with that data. And so I don't think there's going to be this single pane of glass. Matter of fact, that's like the biggest lie in security marketing these days, is single pane of glass. But you especially don't achieve a single pane of glass concept when you're pooling data for multiple business units that have very different kind of use cases for that data. But there's really something powerful behind this data, this idea of aggregation of the data itself into a kind of one place for the business. Because there was a concept coined by a software engineer named Dave McCrory called data gravity. And it's this idea that the more data you get into one place, there's this nonlinear sort of scale of valuable the value of that data being there as it continues to kind of build mass. And so thinking about the fact that the big cloud providers like Azure and GCP, these guys have already kind of built their big solutions to this problem. Things like Azure's Sentinel and BigQuery and Amazon, or I'm sorry, Azure has their data warehouse. But the more we can kind of consolidate that data, I'm not as worried about having multiple different interfaces to the data, but benefiting from the optimization and the efficiency of putting all that data in one place, not worrying about who has what or doesn't have that, or that we're double paying for the same data to be in multiple different solutions. Because it's the data warehousing, I think, that's a lot of the inefficiencies coming from.
And to that point, because if you do have this massive data warehouse somewhere, how do you start with prioritization? Because there aren't a lot of tools actually that are as good at prioritization as they say they are. But now if you have all of this data and you have different teams looking at it, how do you start? What's prioritization 101? Especially if you're not getting rid of any of that old, less valuable data, at least less valuable right now.
Yeah, I think that's it's kind of a tough problem to solve without more of a kind of a specific sort of use case here. But like, different teams obviously will have their specific priorities for data. The idea is if the data lake itself is as optimized as it can be, the storage of that data is as inexpensive as it can be, as it often is with some of these cloud-centric solutions, you don't really have to nickel and dime as much now about prioritization. For instance, if all of our telemetry is going into Amazon S3, that's a fixed cost on all that data that's incredibly low. And now we're just simply going to choose how we access that data, which that's where the cost often comes into play, is querying terabytes or petabytes of data is not a free thing to do. And each team is going to have to now think about their own specific, approach to, what data we query and how we query it. But you're not necessarily as worried anymore about the cost of storing the data, which is the biggest cost that we currently see today. Because right now, if I was going to put a petabyte of data into Splunk, I better be, Pepsi or the Department of Defense, because that bill is going to be big. But if I can pay pennies on the dollar to store that same amount of data, and I only pay now for how I decide to query that data, I have more control now in optimizing my approach. So of course, that comes with its own kind of, focus on training the users of this data, right? Or having optimized applications that are interfacing with the data. But is that kind of speaking to your question?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, you've got whole teams at bigger organizations who are specialists here. And I know, from my company, when our sales team is talking to prospective vendors, there's always one SIEM guy who's like, you're going to wrench this from my cold dead hands. Don't even talk to me about reducing how we use the SIEM and what we use it for. How would you counter that?
Well,
there really is. There's always one guy. It's the same thing on the CMB, by the way. I'm not just picking on the SIEM, but
for sure. Well, I'll start with very delicately, because I've worked with all walks of life in this in this space, and I've seen that personality, right? So very delicately and with compassion, because oftentimes there's trauma behind those types of responses, right? But
I want my job. I want my job.
And certifications,
or it just the fear of change, right? The fear of change, and that's why I think cloud is still kind of a four-letter word in some places. It's this fear of, oh no, I'm giving up the control, or I'm giving up the ownership. It's like, but what did you actually have before, right? It's a perception thing, and so don't. Instead of attacking the position, it's instead sort of educating and informing. But let me tell you how much you stand to gain by adopting this new mindset or adopting this new approach. Today, you can only hold on to a month or two of that data because you're starting to hit up against your license limits. What if I told you we would save money and bump that retention up to a year at the same time, and you're not going to have any less use or control of that data? Matter of fact, you can actually get more creative and more thoughtful about how you use the data, because it's not going to be limited by what the vendor feature set is. It's limited by your imagination and your ability to put something together, or to outsource to have someone else, put together a query script or an interface for you. But in my opinion, the functionality only goes up. It's an education step, though, to kind of teach, because a lot of these folks that have clung to these legacy solutions, they think this is the only way, and this is the only way I know how to do it. I don't want to have to learn a new way, and but it's really taking the time to understand the position that they're in, because if we were allowed to let mindsets like that kind of drive the decisions of the business, well, we would never evolve, we would never innovate, we would never optimize. We would miss so many opportunities. And so those personalities are out there, no doubt about it. But I think it should be a conversation, right? Definitely a conversation. And by the way, let me also say, does my idea or my mindset fit all organizations out there? No. But I will say that even some of the most stringent, most strict organizations, like the Department of Defense, have seen this is actually the way. If you go look at this, the Congress approved sort of IT spending budget for some of the biggest agencies in the Department of Defense and similar, they're going all in on the cloud. They're realizing that, hey, like, these guys are better at doing this than we are. Now, of course, that comes with the caveat that it's Gov Cloud, and it's special contracts and requirements and all that stuff. But the point I'm making is the cloud isn't the enemy, but old school, cling to the old way of doing things mindset, that in fact I think is the enemy of forward progress.
Yeah, and I think there's also the issue of, well, what's next, right? Because we're in an industry that perceives itself as very, very fast moving, but in reality, there's a lot of old stuff that's still around, old processes, old habits that have entrenched themselves within our organizations, even more forward-thinking ones. And so it's this issue of having this perception of what security is versus what's really going on, I think.
For sure. So kind of a broad idea that I have about that is that a lot of the needs that organizations have today around security are not actually based on today's problems. They're based on the last decade or two of tech debt and things like that. And so I do think that you're going to start to see things get better and more optimized, because a lot of those problems will slowly atrophy and fall off. Now, there will always be new problems. Like, for instance, the argument that if we go from on-prem to cloud, the security problems go away. No, they just changed to cloud problems now, right? But there's actually some substantial truth to the fact that, take Exchange, for instance. I mean, that's the best example I can think of is, on-prem Exchange is almost an unsolvable issue today as far as, vulnerabilities, exploits, and attack surface, right? Well, there's huge benefits to moving to in cloud, Azure Exchange. Now, do all of our problems go away? No. So we're still going to have to tackle certain things, but we've eliminated a lot of that old legacy sort of attack surface that some of which may never have a solution for. But I do think, and this is a little controversial, a little bit of hot take, but I do think you're going to see a little bit of a bust of this bubble as more and more of these legacy issues phase out and go away. You're getting a lot more consolidated now with the big cloud providers, not only from an IT perspective, but from a security perspective. Look, they're all trying to consolidate all this into their ecosystem. And while that's very threatening to a lot of product vendors and practitioners alike, I do think it's the right move. I do think it's the right direction, because if you're a Microsoft shop and all your stuff is in Azure and you're bolted into Azure Sentinel and you're using M365 Defender, I mean, that's as integrated as it's ever going to be. And who better to be solving this problem for you than Microsoft? And I'm not fanboying for Microsoft. To the contrary, only in the last recent years have I really started to kind of take a strong appreciation for Microsoft's progress on security. They're one of the top teams in the world now. They're taking it very seriously. And so, and by the way, this echoes true for all the other big providers. So I think we're going to see a lot of consolidation, which is a good thing, but that's, well, depending on what side of the camp you're on, right? For product vendors and service providers, it's a concern. But for businesses looking to solve the security problem, I think that's going to be one of the biggest advantages, is consolidation based on the one or two or three cloud providers of choice. And so I think eventually the huge waves that we see in the space right now will start to calm down, but it's easily going to be another decade or two before you realize it, because of the problem that you brought up, Katie, is that there's still so many legacy problems that are not going away tomorrow.
Yeah, and it seems like we've got a staffing challenge here as well. Like I don't know about your experiences, Eric, but you go in a lot of places and you've got people whose jobs are kind of centered around a vendor product, right? Like they don't know how to do security work, but they do know QRadar's interface, right? And they log into that every day. They click around, they do things. It's they work tickets basically. The SIEM product creates busy work for them. And when you talk about getting folks who can go off in AWS and build something with Kinesis, or maybe you're going to build something with FluentD and some of the open source stuff out there, I'm not even thinking of hiring somebody with a security background. I'm more thinking of hiring somebody with like a software engineering background and I'll teach them the security stuff, but like the core of what I want is that ability to build things, right?
That's right. And so that actually comes back to a point that I opened with. And so I want to kind of remind that I don't think that there is a golden path forward right now for big and mature organizations to just like, oh, let's just walk away from our legacy way of doing this. Because you're right, the talent required to kind of wield some of these tools is not likely something you've already got in-house on the security team, but it should maybe kind of trigger a change in hiring processes to say, I no longer want people with just a bunch of Splunk certifications, right? Because I don't want to forever be wed to this product and therefore only have a team of people that only know how to use this product, right? So just, over time, starting to kind of change hiring processes, trainings that we make available to our folks. I'm not just going to send you to training for Carbon Black or Cylance. Like I want you to be more agnostic in your knowledge, because we should be able to rip and replace any one of these tools or adopt a new one, and you should be able to effectively wield that tool, right? Because if you're just hiring button pushers, that's all you'll ever have are button pushers. And so, I have a fairly small team at Recon, but I say that the firepower of that team is something I'm incredibly proud of, and it's because every one of my analysts is also a SIEM engineer, a detection engineer, and an ingestion sort of troubleshooter. I mean, they know all layers and pieces of the stack. We built our own interface to our data lake, and because of that, we are experts at every single layer of that stack, right? So, and because of that, the kind of benefit of that is we're an extremely effective security operations team as a result of it. But I won't lie and say that it's easy, right? It takes time and talent and training and a lot of hard work and focus. But the end result of that is phenomenal. The team that I built at Recon, I'm proud to say, is one of the best and most effective teams I've ever been a part of. But it's because of that approach, that very diligent approach of we're going to hire critical thinkers and builders that are also analytical and can detect threats and respond. I don't want just one slice of that pie, right? I'd like to, but to your point, Adrian, it's very, very difficult to hire and build these types of teams, and there's the talent shortage, and a lot of contributing factors that kind of make that a pipe dream for many organizations, which is why consolidation is going to start to take the pressure off big enterprises that can't attract that talent. Well, consolidation starts to kind of become the other end of that solution, right? Because if we can consolidate, get everything integrated, now you're benefiting from the cloud providers kind of weigh in on it. Sentinel does a lot of things just kind of magically out of the box, right? So I need a little bit less brilliant talent on my team to wield these tools because of how tightly consolidated they are. But hey, we're not in the picture perfect age yet of all that, but we're on our way, I think.
Awesome. So we need full stack security engineers, more full stack security engineers.
Yep. Just don't take mine.
Yeah. Awesome. Eric, thank you so much for joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly today. This has been awesome.
My pleasure, Adrian. Thanks for having me.
All right, stay tuned. When we come back, we're going to talk blue and red team insights with Tim Malcolmvetter from Sideris.